Hello YouTube. Language. It's an essential part of life, but not necessarily an essential part of most games, as usually you can just put a game in whatever language the game supports and suddenly all characters speak your language, or at least one that you speak. Pretty convenient, but it's really not how it works in the lore. In the lore, at least in the Elder Scrolls universe, almost all cultures either have their own language or have had their own language at some point in the past. The Argonians, for example, have their own language, and it's nearly incomprehensible to other races. And even the language spoken in most of Tamriel, Tamriellic, isn't just English. So today I'm giving you an overview of the different languages on Tamriel, and after that I'm giving you a collection of deep dives into several different languages on Tamriel that I covered in the past. All of this has timestamps, so you can skip to any part of the video that interests you, so I hope you'll enjoy it. Alright, so strap in and let's talk about Tamriel's languages. So, language. Like I said in the intro, in the games, for gameplay purposes, all people basically speak English. Sometimes they'll throw in a word of their own language here or there to give flavor, like the dragons do, or the Khajiit in the Elder Scrolls Online. But in general, the people and creatures that you'll be talking to will be speaking English, or rather Tamriellic, which I will give you a bit of a deep dive into a bit later in the video. Now, interestingly enough, while basically everyone speaks English or Tamriellic, it's often a bit vague what people's actual spoken language is. Sometimes it's implied that a character, especially dragons and sometimes Khajiit and Argonians as well, are using a second language while talking to you, so they are consciously speaking English or Tamriellic to you, while for example, in private, they would be talking some other language. While in other cases, the spoken word or written word that we read or hear in the games are English for gameplay purposes, while it's implied that they're actually speaking or writing in another language, and it's just auto-translated for us as the player, if that makes sense. A great example of this are some of the journal notes that we find from the time of the Dragon Cult. The Dragon Cult spoke probably Old Nordic or Atmoran, or perhaps a mix of Old Nordic and Atmoran, which also mixed a little bit of dragon language in. But for gameplay purposes, we just see their notes as English, otherwise the player would have to translate everything. Although it's often a bit vague where that line is. But you know, considering how extremely important language is to gameplay to make you understand what you're playing, this all being a bit vague is logical. But there's actually quite a lot of lore on languages. First of all, we know that several different types of creatures that we fight in the different games have their own languages, and some of them, in Daggerfall at least, we as the player can even learn in order to make these creatures friendly and non-hostile. Good examples of these are imps, nymphs and spriggans, which all have their own language, and by knowing said language you can make them non-hostile in the game. Same goes for centaurs, lamia and harpies, by the way, which are also known to have their own languages. In fact, with some creatures we can even see different variations or dialects of language and related sub-languages. A great example of this is the language of giants. Giants, as in the giants that we see in Skyrim, actually very much have their own language that they use to communicate with one another. It's a language reportedly of guttural sounds and loud deep noises, which seems extremely weird and unintelligible to the other intelligent races of Tamriel, as it's really incomprehensible to most people, although it seems that some people are at least able to understand them, as there are some rare examples in history of mortals actually being friends with giants and even partners, as we have examples of half-giants in the lore. Quite a few actually, so that implies at least a decent amount of people are able to speak the giant language. That having been said, there are several different types of giant in the Elder Scrolls universe, and we know for a fact that some of them, specifically frost giants and sea giants, also have language, and that it's a bit implied that these languages are actually different to the regular giant language. They're very similar, but they seem to have some differences in their pronunciation, which means that some people speculate that they may have different sub-languages. But it's also very possible that the frost giants and sea giants speak the same language, but just with a different dialect, meaning that a giant and sea giant would probably be able to understand each other in the same way that someone from the UK would be able to understand someone from the US. Basically same language, but with some other words for certain things and a bit different pronunciation. But how exactly that works is mostly speculation on my part, as we know too little about the giant language and the frost and sea giant languages to definitively say if they have different languages altogether, which evolved from a common starting point, or the same language but with a different dialect. Talking about common starting points, however, as we'll talk about more in detail during some of the language deep dives, basically every language spoken by the playable races, other than the Argonian language Chel, seems to be a far descendant language of the language Old Elnofax, the language spoken by the so-called Elmophae, or First Ones, the first beings to walk on the face of Tamriel after the mortal plane's creation. This language then split into different branches, and those different branches evolved into different languages, from the Elven languages to the human languages, as we'll talk about in detail in a bit. Now, the interesting thing here is that despite it being the common origin point of many languages, Old Elnofax at this point is mostly a dead language, although just like the dragon language, this language seems to carry a certain amount of power, as it's still used quite a bit in magical circles for spells and incantations, and as such, basically every mage worth their salt seems to know at least a little bit of Old Elnofax, or should at least, which is super interesting. Now, something else that's quite interesting is that Tamriel has its fair share of dead languages, with some of them even being so dead that none or almost none can understand them anymore. A great example of this is Ancient Nordic, or Ancient Atmoran to be precise, the language spoken on Atmora, which was the ancient home continent of the Nords and possibly all of humanity. Now, we know that Atmoran as a language, at least more than 25 centuries after the final migration from Atmora during the Second Era and later the Third and Fourth Era, is basically a dead language that even scholars can barely understand. That's because this original language that came from Atmora seems to have mixed a bit with both the dragon language and the elven language over the years to eventually create the regular Old Nordic language, which was the Nords' own language during the late Meretic and early First Era, only for then that language to die again when it seems that Common Tamriellic became the standard language in Skyrim after several centuries. This is where the point that I made earlier comes into play again, with ancient Nordic texts basically being displayed in English for us. Meanwhile, they might be in ancient Atmoran, they might be in some kind of proto-language which mixed a little bit with the dragon language, that might be in Old Nordic. There are several different types of languages that flourished in Skyrim throughout the years, at least based on our understanding, and we just see everything in English. Which is of course very convenient for the gameplay, but it might give you some depth to know this lore. Now, we have some more examples of dead languages, such as the language Old Nedic, which was the language used by the early humans in Cyrodiil, which may or may not have evolved from Atmoran. See my video on Atmora for my full reasoning there, because there's this whole debate whether or not humanity truly came from Atmora or not. Watch my video on Atmora for that whole discussion, it's a whole different can of worms. There's also Old Orcish, the language used by the orcs in the First and even the Second Era, which would change to the new standard Orcish that we find in the Elder Scrolls II Daggerfall during the Third Era. And there's also Ancient Kuthringi language, the language of the now extinct silver-skinned humans of Blackmarsh, who had their own language, which became dead by the time of their extinction. In fact, it wouldn't be much of a stretch to say that the other human races of Blackmarsh that went extinct, because there were quite a few tribal races like the Kuthringi, like for example the Orma, which I covered recently, these probably all had their own language, which are now all dead languages, along with their speakers, as they basically all became extinct. We also know that Old Bretic, the Old Breton language, is mostly dead now, although some druids still use a language that seems to have evolved in some way from Old Bretic. And we also know that several Elvish languages, specifically Dwemeris, or the Dwemer, the Snow Elf language, and the Sinistral, or left-handed elf language, are also dead. That last one mostly because the Yokunans, the ancient ancestors of the Redguards, killed all the left-handed elves on Yokuda. But talking about Yokuda, the ancient home continent of the Redguards, or then known as the Yokudans, the ancient ancestors of the Redguards also had their own language, which was called Yoku, which most people have abandoned for Tamriellic, or versions of Tamriellic. Because when the Yokudans landed on Tamriel and eventually became the Redguards, a lot of them adopted Tamriellic, but some, even by the 3rd and 4th era, still seem to speak Old Yoku, as do probably those left on the ruins of Yokuda nowadays, as we know that there are still people who live on the ruins of that ancient continent. Oh, and the races of Akavir also seem to have their own languages, but whether they all use a same Akaviri language, so one language for the entire continent, or whether or not they all have their own languages, we just don't know. We know far too little about Akavir to say anything concrete about that. Now, that having been said, it's time to get into some of the deep dives, so this is where the collection part of this video starts, as I've edited several of my old lore videos down to the lore, where I did deep dives into some of the more interesting languages on Tamriel for this video. So the video would be as complete as possible, including this whole introduction on languages, complete with some of my older content. We're starting out by talking about the Khajiit language, which is called Ta'agra. Then we will talk about the strange Argonian language Gel, after which I will give a deep dive into the Elvish languages on Tamriel. Then I'll talk about the Dragon language, and then finally I'll talk about Tamriellic, the standard language. It all has timestamps, so you can skip anything at any point if you like, or if you've already seen some of the older content. Also, in some parts I got some pronunciation help with my friend Mr. Nerddragon, who is far better at pronunciation than I am. Oh, and some of this is much older content, and I covered some of this in the very early days of the channel, so the narration may not be as smooth as you are used to now, but I promise the lore is still super interesting. So, that said, let's talk about the Khajiit language Ta'agra, and I'll give the mic to my past self of about 3 years ago. So, as I said before, the Khajiit language is called Ta'agra. It's a highly melodic, guttural and expressive language. One of the most recognizable features of Ta'agra, and the one that most Elder Scrolls fans are probably most familiar with, is the use of the third person to refer to oneself, be it via the Khajiit's name by referring to the race or by using this one. Examples of this are when, for example, Jazargo says, "Jazargo is an accomplished destruction mage," or the famous sentence, "Khajiit has wares if you have coin," which is spoken by Khajiit traders all around Tamriel. And also in something like, "This one is glad to be of help." So that's all referring to oneself in the third person. Other notable features of Ta'agra include the frequent uses of the letters J, R and S. The J is often always a soft one, not being pronounced like a hard J like in Jane, Jade and so on. A hard J would often, but not always, happen with the inclusion of the letter H after it. S is also a very frequently used letter, and it's very often frequently treated as its own syllable, marked with an apostrophe like in the word surrender. Talking about apostrophes, they themselves are also a very common sight in Ta'agra, and the R is basically always a rolled one, and I really can't do it, but you'll hear some of them in Mr. Nerddragon's voice clips later on. An interesting grammatical feature of Ta'agra is its sentence structure. In English the verb comes before the subject, but in Ta'agra the verb comes after it. For example, the sentence
Zwing fodurar rabi
translates to "I have a yellow writing utensil," so a quill. But the most literal translation without adapting the sentence structure would be "yellow writing utensil have" in the first person. In other words, the Ta'agra sentence structure is verb, subject, object instead of subject, verb, object, which brings me to the real life inspiration to Ta'agra, which is probably Arabic, because Arabic also follows the same sentence structure, and it's both thematically and phonetically similar to Ta'agra. So Mr. Nerddragon and I presume that it's a direct inspiration. Now, we'll cover some of the more important words in Ta'agra and also some of their name conventions. Starting with the word Khajiit. It's a composite of two words, Kash meaning sand, and It is a suffix that indicates occupation or place of residence. So the most accurate translation for Khajiit would be desert walker or desert dweller. Khajiiti names are most commonly describing the skills or abilities of those that they refer to. Family names are a rarity, and a Khajiit would make their name more unique by adding an eponym in either Ta'agra or in Tamriellic, like Maik the Liar or Kreen Rendo. A big part of Khajiiti naming convention is to use honorifics. It's a reflection of their status in society and therefore may change during their life depending on the context and depending on the flow of their life. It's considered extremely rude and insulting to address someone without an honorific or without the appropriate honorific. The rule is that only one honorific may be applied at a time, although two can be used. This is rare. However, since the Khajiit believe using two honorifics is a sign of either great pride or great ignorance, it's very rare. It is also very rare for a non-Khajiit to have a Khajiiti honorific applied to their names, but when it happens it's usually when it's a very important person in Khajiiti society, such as a foreign ambassador or such whom the Khajiiti respect greatly and has an influence on their society. The honorifics are usually applied at the start of one's name, or in other words as a prefix separated from the name by an apostrophe or a hyphen. Although in some cases it can be a suffix, so be placed after the name. When speaking the common language, so Tamriellic, the honorific is treated as an actual part of the name, since honorifics aren't used this way in Tamriellic. As a curiosity, this use of honorifics is very similar to the real-life Japanese language, although they apparently have their honorifics almost always at the end of the name, such as san or kun. If that's not true, you can correct me in the comments if there's also prefix versions of honorifics in Japanese. I honestly don't know, I'm not a Japanese expert. But to get back to the Khajiit language, just to show what I mean, I've got a list of Khajiit honorifics which I'm putting on the screen now. The honorifics on the left are for males and the ones on the right are for females. As you can see, some of the Khajiit names in the games make a lot more sense now. If you look at the bottom of the list, you can see that Re is an honorific granted to chieftains, kings and even the main. For example, Re Saad is the chief of the merchants in Skyrim and has this honorific, as has Akuz Re, which is the main of Elsewhere in the Elder Scrolls Online. Also in Skyrim there's a Khajiit trader called Dro Marash. We may conclude that he's an older Khajiit called Marash, who is seen as very wise or is seen as patriarch of his family, hence why he has the honorific Dro. Jazargo is a young Khajiit called Zargo who is single, and so on. Knowing this, if you know a Khajiiti name, you can actually know something about the personality or about the kind of person that the Khajiit is, depending on the honorifics that are applied to their name. Anyway, let's move on from the names for now, because there's a few instances in the game that we're actually able to read Ta'agra phrases or even hear Khajiiti speaking Ta'agra. The closest that we get to hearing an actual conversation in Ta'agra is between Cyrus and a Khajiit named Saatra in the Elder Scrolls Adventures Redguard, in which the latter speaks Ta'agra frequently during the conversation. Here's a quick sample.
You should know you got me the job.
Next to this conversation, there's also a few texts that we can find about Ta'agra, like the book
Azir Trajijazeri.
that we can find in multiple Elder Scrolls games. A nice example of a complete sentence in Ta'agra would be in the burnt scripture found in the Moongrave Fane in the Elder Scrolls Online, which reads as follows.
Zengrili an Zengji Tazjadi Afa Shabar Aidifozei Zaiguti Salitatna Jadi Ranjif Adivasanirni Jadi Lurma Rajkono Viti Shabar Morna Anfsi Khajiit Harifse.
Which translates into Joan and Jode close their eyes, in the dreamless sleep of death they fall, until below the world they lie, forever lost in darkness, and the true moon reigns supreme. And that is about all I was able to gather on the Khajiiti language in the past. Now, next up, let's talk about another language that's pretty prevalent on Tamriel, and that's weird. Gel, the language of the Argonians. Boss Self, take it away. Gel as a language is very different from any other language on Tamriel, and it might actually be the oldest language of them all. For as far as we know, it never truly evolved or devolved into sub-languages throughout history, since that would change the language to a dramatic degree. We'll get to that later. Another big reason why it never devolved or evolved is most likely because all Argonians inside Blackmarsh are more or less connected with each other by having all their connections to their creators, the histories, and then through the histories being connected to each other. It's believed that the histories learned the Argonian language to them, and staying in contact with the trees might have been the reason that it hasn't really evolved, as in our own world, language evolves when groups of speakers have been separated for a long time, but in this case the entire group remains somewhat connected to each other through their creators, meaning that any evolving or devolving from that reason would be very slow. And in a way, it wouldn't really make sense for this language to evolve, as we hear in lore that Gel is as close of a speech to actual thought as can be. According to Argonians, their language is able to convey thoughts into speech in a way that no other language is capable of doing. To be able to do so, one must be fully fluent in the language and have a very precise pronunciation. And in addition to that, must also have very precise body language, as body language like whipping your tail as an Argonian or squinting your eyes is a very important part of the language to convey your message fully. To be able to use this language to its fullest extent, the Argonians learn it directly from the Hist in their youth, among other things, by hatching their eggs close to the trees and drinking their sap in their youth. We have some examples of Argonians growing up outside of Blackmarsh with limited connection to the Hist, and this actually completely damages their ability to learn the language, because they have a very bad time to learn the language. They will never quite get on the level of their Black Marsh native brethren, meaning that to function in Argonian society, it's best for an Argonian to spend his youth in Black Marsh, as otherwise your connection to your race, because the connection to your language, will be very severely severed, as they will never truly be able to nail the very precise body language and very precise pronunciation. It is also hard for other races to learn the Argonian language, as it's innately different to any other language on Tamriel. As said before, most Tamriellic languages follow a similar structure, as they all come from Old Elnuvax, the language of the Old Elnuvae, and thus, for example, grammar rules will usually be familiar to an extent to, for example, a human trying to learn the High Elven language. Its structure and concepts will be largely similar. But Gel is very different. It relies on very precise pronunciation. If you have an accent, it could change a part of your message. The fact that an accent or any different pronunciations can completely change your message may also be one of the reasons why the language never really evolves, or very slowly evolves. And one of the biggest barriers to foreigners learning the language, or Argonians learning one of the other languages of Tamriel, is the fact that the way that the language handles time are very different. Tamriellic languages are largely structured in a way like ours. They are time dependent, with past and future tenses. So for example, I can say, I will finish this video in a short while, or after a short while I will have finished this video, or before making this video I was playing Luigi's Mansion. All those statements have a concept of time in them. Gel doesn't have those concepts of time. There is no concept of time and no way for me to explain this very clearly how it would work, as this is one of the limitations of the English language. You cannot say something without a point of time being used as a reference or being involved, be it past, present or future. But in the Argonian language, all those, past, present and future, are all at the same time true, and neither of them are true at the same time. There isn't even a word for time in Gel. Everything is just one state of being, and they take a holistic approach to events. Argonians find it very strange why we would want to establish a linear sequence of events. They find it strange we think in a linear way, in a linear sequence of events, and they think that it would be way more convenient like they do it, as a holistic apprehension, meaning that they take all events as equal, not having the concept of time. If you think this is weird, it is, both to you and me. English and my own native language, Dutch, are all time-dependent languages. However, some languages do have some form of time independence in them. For example, the Chinese language. In that language it's possible to say an action without a sense of time. Unfortunately, that isn't possible for me and most of my viewers, but it's possible for some languages and for the Argonians. Maybe if there's some Chinese viewer here, maybe he can explain it better in the comments. If you're there, explain it, please. However, learning the concept of time dependence in other languages and the time independence of Gel is by far the biggest struggle for anyone trying to learn Gel or trying to learn another language if their native language is Gel. As far as we know, there's no fluent Gel speaker among non-Argonians. A lot of other races can learn it, they can speak it, and they can understand it, for example as diplomats or whatever function they may have in Black Marsh. We know of some humans that have learned it to a good extent, but they will never truly be fluent. They will never learn the subtleties in pronunciation that can change up everything, or the body language aspect of it in such a perfect way that they can convey their feelings in a right way. In terms of Argonians, well, as we've seen in the games, Argonians can pretty much learn our language. It's very hard for them to learn it at first, but due to the language being more simple, in the sense that it doesn't require any body languages or requires very precise pronunciation. For example, if you have an accent like an Argonian accent, that's fine, people will still understand you. There are many Argonians that are fluid in other languages, of course. That said, the language itself can sound very weird to outsiders. It's said that it can sound like grunts and squeaks to most non-speakers when Argonians speak it very fast. For example, presumably after hearing some Argonians speak their language very quickly, the Mad Emperor Pelagius III waned himself in the illusion that he could actually speak with them in that language. And when an Argonian ambassador came to the palace, he just made random squeaks and noises to an Argonian ambassador. I found that pretty funny. Now, in terms of pronunciation, I'm not even really gonna try to pronounce it correctly, as I have trouble with English as it is, as most of you know. But a lot of the letters and combinations are pronounced very differently in the Gel language. For example, the H is almost always silent. Think about the word sex, halil, which is usually pronounced as says lil. So the H is completely silent, and the X's get pronounced as Z's. As a final note, Argonian names are often a word or multiple words in gel, and are sometimes directly translated when an Argonian lives in a different society. Think for example about names like Stands in Shadows, which are the kind of names that you usually hear associated with Argonians. These are names that are translated from their gel names, and they get these names apparently at birth, when they get in contact with history. It's not known if the parents or the elders give the names to the little Argonians, or if the Hist directly sort of conveys the name upon the little Argonian, but we know it happens at birth. And these names usually describe the Argonian as a person, and can of course be translated to other languages, like I've mentioned before. In all respects, Gel is a very different and difficult language to learn, but it's also very interesting and surprisingly fleshed out in the lore. There's even an English to Gel translator on the internet that also translates Gel to English. However, I do not know if that's purely fan-made and uses made-up words as well, or if it's only using the in-lore words, but if you're really interested in the Argonian language, I really recommend checking it out. It's pretty interesting.
And that's about all I've been able to gather on the Argonian language. Now, next up, let's talk about a collection of languages, the Elven Languages of Tamriel, which there are, of course, quite a few, since we have several different races of elf. Past me, take it away again.
So, first of all, most of the Elvish languages share many similarities, as all of them originally came from the Altmeri language, which in itself is an evolution of Old Elnofax, the language of the Elnofae, which are basically the precursors of all races on Tamriel, save for the Argonians. But this Altmeri language, let's call it the base for all Elvish languages, had its origin on the continent of Altmuris. This continent is where the language developed from a dialect of Old Elnofax to a wholly separate language. On present and past day Tamriel there have been many languages of this original Altmeri language. There was Aelidon, the language of the Aelids, Falmer language, or Falmeri, Dunmeri, the language of the Dark Elves, and Dwemeris, the language of the Dwemer. There's of course also Old Orcish and New Orcish, which we will talk about later in the video. And there are different sub-languages like Bosmeri and Piandonean, which we don't know a lot about unfortunately, but we'll touch on that later in the video as well. It's presumed that the High Elves that we see right now in Tamriel and Somerset still use a dialect of the Old Altmeri language, but that other races of elves around Tamriel have evolved a language of their own. While the language of the Altmer right now in Tamriel is probably also an evolved version, it's known to be the closest thing to Old Altmeris that we still have in terms of language. You see, even if these languages share a similar origin, that doesn't really mean that these languages are not inherently different. You can view this whole group of languages, the Altmeri languages, as a sort of language family. Think of how we Dutch, because I'm Dutch, speak a Germanic language, Dutch. But so do the Germans, the Swedish, the Norwegians, the Icelandic people, and even the English are technically a Germanic language. All these languages are Germanic languages and they share an origin point somewhere in history, but they have evolved so far apart that while you can see similarities, they are different enough to have very different words, grammar rules, and in some cases even sentence structure. I, as a Dutch person, can certainly recognize that someone from Norway speaks a Germanic language, and it's a bit like my language, but I can't understand it. Same with the Elvish languages. For example, a High Elf would be able to recognize an Altmeri language like Dunmeris, but they won't really understand it instantly, unless of course they studied and learned the language. It's basically the same case with the alphabets. If we take a look at this image that our good friends at the Imperial library have compiled from the fonts that we find in the game, then we can see that it's really clear that Dwemer, Aelid and Falmer alphabets definitely originated from the same starting point, but that there's a lot of variations at the end. With some effort, an Aelid would of course be able to read like Falmer runes, but while some are similar, there are also definitely some wildly different runes and there are some significant differences. Unfortunately, we don't really have any concrete examples of Altmeri alphabet, however I can probably assume that they use the same alphabet as Aelids or close to Aelids, as we will touch on later in the video. Now, before I talk some more in depth about the languages, I wish to group them into two categories.
One is the languages that are still used on Tamriel, which the people on Tamriel can still translate and speak. The other is dead languages, which people on Tamriel can only translate, because they don't speak it anymore and it's not actively used anymore. So essentially a dead language. Let me explain. We as people in our own universe, just Earth, we cannot completely translate any of these languages in the Elder Scrolls universe. The most complete language in the Elder Scrolls universe that we have, with sources that we have in our world, is the Dragon language. All other languages we only know words and bits from. While we know, for example, the Dwemer alphabet, that's only the first step towards translating a text. We don't know the meaning behind some of the words, even if we get it in just our alphabet. Which is, of course, the second crucial step in being able to read another language that's written in another alphabet. We know only like 0.1% of all the words in any given Elvish language. At max, probably. I dare say that we know a bit more about dead languages like Falmer and Dwemery than the alive languages like Altmery and Dunmery. But that is because in the games everything is simplified. Languages only exist in written sources like books and an occasional word that someone throws in. Most of the languages are usually just translated to English instantly for, gaming purposes. We wouldn't be able to understand it if somebody just started talking Aelid to us. What I mean by this is that if you play a High Elf in the Elder Scrolls Online and you visit the Somerset Isles, everybody around you is talking in an Altmeri language. And so do you, actually, as the player as an High Elf. But for gameplay purposes, this is all English. It's all an English interface for us. While in lore, there are a lot of different languages that are, of course, being spoken around Tamriel. So, while these languages like Altmery, Bosmery and Dunmery are very much alive right now, we don't have much concrete things to go on to translate them. In terms of Falmer, Aeliden and Dwemery, however, the dead languages, we have a little more to go on because there is a lot of historical writings in the games, and there are of course murals and inscriptions that relate to quests and of course to the lore of these long lost civilizations. Which basically means we just have a lot more sources for these languages and thus we know a bit more about these languages. For example, the ancient Aelid language, Aeliden. We know not a lot about the language itself, but still a fair amount because many inscriptions of this language actually appear throughout the games and some even made sense. Especially in Oblivion there were some, and even in the Elder Scrolls Blades there's an inscription, which can be translated as I found out. Online there are pretty big dictionaries of the words that we know in these languages. These languages might look big, but remember that it's maximum 0.1% of the total language. Even though it's a small portion of the language that we actually know, it's still quite impressive what the community has been able to extract from what the developers just gave us in the games, which is very little to really build a language. Using these resources, however, I've been able to partially translate this Aelid tablet from the Elder Scrolls Blades, which was honestly a lot of fun to do. But remember, I couldn't have done it without the pre-existing resources of the people in the community who worked on all these resources. If you look at this tablet, you can see the Aelid runes in it, which translated to our alphabet say Ran, Selamariel, Nenagai. Now, we have no idea what Ran means, but people online have speculated that it might be the word Aaron, which means king, and then Selamariel, which is the name of an Aelid king, who plays a large role in the main quest of the Elder Scrolls Blades. And finally there's the word Nenagai, which is most likely a combination of the words Nen and Naga, which means water and death, combined to waters of death. So the full inscription of this tablet likely says something like King Selamariel, waters of death. So most likely something like King Selamariel went to the waters of death, or has gone to the waters of death. To do this was actually quite fun, and again, wouldn't have been possible without, all the community resources already available. The Dwemer and Falmer language, however, are very similar in the regard that we have historical text from both and a lot more sources from both compared to the Aelid language. However, unfortunately, some of these texts can be very nonsensical and are just random key presses by the developers, translating into things like AB, HI, QR, ST, as if they just took excerpts from the alphabet for certain runic decorations on things like doors, which they probably did, to be honest. But there are some actual translatable things. And those translatable things go into two categories for both Dwemery and Falmery. You have the ones where their runes are used to directly type English language texts, like the Falmer tomes you can find in Dawnguard, because you can quite literally just translate them yourself using the Falmer alphabet, and then an English text rolls out. Another good example is the Easter egg paying respect to a developer's father in Morrowind with Dwemer runes. But there are in fact also some actual examples of Dwemer and Falmer language, with the most notorious being of course Calcelmo's stone in Markarth. It's a large stone with 2 encryptions written in it. These 2 encryptions are the same text, they say the same thing, but in 2 different languages and in 2 different alphabets. The top text is written in Dwemer language, both alphabet and language. The bottom one written in Falmer language, and of course their alphabet. For the longest time the community had no idea what these texts meant, but one of the writers of the Elder Scrolls actually gave us the English translation for both texts. It's a text for the Falmer refugees who fled into the Dwemer cities after they were forced out of Skyrim by the Nords. It reads as follows. And so it was that your people were given passage to our steam gardens, and the protection of our mathematics. Many of your people have perished under the roaring snow-throated kings of Mara, and your wills were broken. And we heard you, sent our machines against your enemies to thereby take you under. Only by the grace of the Dwemer did your culture survive, and only by the 15 and 1 tones did your new lives begin. We do not desire thanks, for we do not believe in it. We do not ask for gratitude, as we do not believe in it. We only ask you to accept to partake in the symbol of our bond, the fruit of our stones. And as your vision clouds, as the darkness set in, fear not. Know only our mercy and the radiance of our affection, which unbinds your bones to the earth before, and sets your final path to the music of your new eternity. This text is extremely interesting in its own right, as it's the last thing most Falmer read before being blinded by the Dwemer and later be enslaved after being promised refuge. We don't have time to analyze it now, but it's more of a thing for a future Falmer-Dwemer video or something like that. But the most interesting thing is that it is written in both languages. Meaning that if you know one of the 2 languages, you can use this stone to start learning the other. We know that this very stone is what helped Calcelmo in Skyrim to learn the Falmer language, and put him in the position to translate Falmer tones. And we have to understand that this stone in general is very important as a source for scholars to decipher the Falmer language, since many of the translation sources for it have been lost to history. Meanwhile, Dwemer language still has an abundance of sources, since there's multiple books written in both Dwemery and Altmery, the latter of which is still used in the Summers and Isles presumably. This makes translation to and from Dwemery relatively easy for in-universe scholars like Calcelmo. Unfortunately for us game lore freaks, it's a little harder, as we are given limited source material in the games. Unlike, in-universe researchers who can just go to a Dwemer ruin and start translating, inscriptions, we have to do it with whatever textures Bethesda decides to give us. But my point is that this stone is one of the main links to the preservation of the Falmer language and history, as it's the only stone of its kind known to exist, with which we can use it to, translate Dwemer to Falmer or Falmer to Dwemer, and Dwemer is still a language that can be relatively easily learned. This stone is actually loosely based on the Rosetta Stone in our universe, as probably some of you are history buffs were already thinking, which is a stone depicting a text in ancient Greek and ancient Egyptian. And the ancient Egyptian, of course, in their, before then, relatively unknown hieroglyphs. We couldn't translate anything before that. This stone became key in translating ancient hieroglyphs and, research to Egyptian history in general. This is really like this stone that Calcelmo has, with the Dwemer commandment on it. Another interesting tidbit to know about these dead languages is that it's speculated that the Falmer language is actually a language which combines elements of the Dwemer language and the Altmery language, and some original elements. This is speculated on the grounds of having a couple similarities between the languages. Just like some think that certain elements of Eiliden actually influenced the human Cyrodiilic language, since many of the early Needs in Cyrodiil of course lived under the Aelids in a system of slavery for a very long time. And thus a lot of people speculate that they might have taken elements of the language of their former masters and incorporated into their own human language. Now, in terms of languages that are still alive, we have Altmery, spoken by the High Elves, of which we primarily know that it's a little bit similar to Eiliden. Many words of the language of the Aelids actually appear in the language of the High Elves. This is because the Aelid language never really evolved very far away from the root Altmery language, neither did the High Elf language. So while we have little sources on pure Altmery language, we can assume that their runes look a lot like Aelid runes, and that their language is largely identical to the Aelid language, as the Altmery language is also very close to the original Altmery language, which we know that the Aelid language is very close to. So most likely it will also have very similar grammatical rules. Now, the Dunmer language is a bit different. We know that unlike other languages, Bethesda has not developed it beyond a few words. For example, Falmer, Aelid and Dwemer language have some known grammatical rules. This has not been developed out of game for Dunmerry. There are probably grammar rules and a lot more words known in-universe because it's an actual language that we know exists. It's just that we don't know them, we don't have any sources to analyze it. All that we really know about the Dunmer language are some words, and we know that it's written in Daedric letters, which is most likely coming from the fact that Dunmer primarily worshipped the Daedric lords, apart from the tribunal of course during that period. And thus they have probably adapted their language to the Daedric alphabet. We know select words from the language, like the word Enwa, meaning outlander or slave, but other than that, we don't really know anything of it. We honestly know even less of the Bosmer language, of the Wood Elves, of which we know that it exists, and we know that it's been influenced by the Aelid language at some point, but other than that, we have nothing. We don't have any other information on the language. Same for Piandanean, the language of the Sea Elves. We know it exists because King Orgdam of Piandane is known to have a translator that translates other languages to Piandanean. We just don't know much else, unfortunately. That's just literally all we know.
And that's about all I've been able to find on the Elvish languages. Next up, let's talk about the language at least Skyrim players are pretty familiar with. The Dragon language. The language of the dragons that we shout in the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim. Past me, take the stage again.
The Dragon language is one of the languages that has evolved from the old Elnofax language. We can conclude this on the fact that in its basis it's very similar to other languages. The Dragon language first and foremost uses an alphabetic script, meaning that the language is written using loose letters, just like all Elvish languages, human languages on Tamriel, Yokudan script and Akaviri script. So it's not an iconographic script, meaning that it doesn't use pictures for words, but instead makes up words using different letters. Secondly, this language uses a lot of the same grammar rules as the other languages, meaning that sentence structure and the way of speaking is also very similar to other languages. Now, other than of course using other words, there are some things that differentiate this language from other languages. First of all, its alphabet is different from the common human alphabet, or the Latin alphabet in our universe, as it contains 35 different symbols or letters which convey sounds. 25 of these symbols basically convey the same sounds as those in the Latin alphabet, having a symbol for every letter in the Latin alphabet from A to Z, with an exception of the letter C, which is not represented. However, even then, the letter C is represented in Elder Scrolls Legends. However, there it's used in a very doubtful way, but technically we also have a symbol for the letter C, it's just not in the original lore. So when we count the letter C, there would be 36 different symbols. In addition to that, there are 9 other symbols which are used for the sounds that we need 2 letters for in the Latin alphabet. Like for example the sound UR, so U and R, has its own symbol. There are also some symbols for double vowels, like for example 2 U's, so UU, which are essentially stronger sounding U's, but having their own symbol to them now. The symbols themselves also have a very interesting story to them, as they basically came to be when the dragons would carve their words into the stone. The prevailing theory is that the dragon would hold its thumb of their claw in one spot, and then have the other fingers of the claws circle around it while carving it out. The grammar of the language also has some distinct differences. There are for example no apostrophes, and the language tends to place prepositional phrases earlier in the sentence than in English, and it does not have a tense. Also, if a word is pluralized, like the word slave, which is R, you have to basically place another of the last letter at the end and then place an E at the end. So to say, if you want to say slaves instead of slave, you say are instead of R, if that makes sense. There are also a lot of words that you combine to make different words, which we see for example a lot in ancient languages in our world. This means that to invent a new word you combine 2 pre-existing words. Now, an interesting quality of this language is that it contains power. When spoken by the dragons or gifted individuals, speaking the language can turn into materialized power. This is what we call shouts. For example, when you speak the word for fire, yol, you can essentially breathe fire if you know its true meaning. That's what we call the power of the Thu'um. With each word which carries power, a true shout requires 3 words to unlock its full potential. Take for example Fus Roda, basically the most well-known shout of all of Skyrim. With only Fus you can push an enemy slightly and make them stagger, but the true power unlocks with all 3 words, Fus Roda. For dragons, learning the language is basically intuitive, and they can pick the language up easily and share in the knowledge of others to learn the true meaning behind the word, and unlock the power of the Thu'um for themselves. This is also something that we can see with the Dragonborn, as they essentially have the soul of a dragon. However, for regular mortals, learning this is very hard, and it requires years of study and meditation. In ancient times, when the dragons ruled over humanity, only the dragons and their most trusted priests knew how to use the words of power, and knew how to use the Thu'um and learn the true meaning behind the words. However, during the Dragon War, the dragon Parthenax, as instructed by the goddess Kain, taught mankind how to use the power of the Thu'um, causing the Dragon War to shift in the humans' favor. During this time, humanity even crafted its own shout, born out of the hatred for the dragons, using the 3 words which were basically incomprehensible to the dragons. Yor, Za, Frul, or Mortal, Finite, Temporary, which was their most powerful weapon against the dragons, as they could not comprehend these words, as the dragons themselves are at their core immortal, eternal, and everlasting. So essentially this shout is the complete opposite of what a dragon is supposed to be, and basically is a very powerful weapon against them when used as a shout. Dragons themselves are also named in the dragon language. Unlike with most mortals, the names of dragons are very important. They often come in 3 or 2 words in Dovazul, which together characterize the dragon who has that name. Some in-universe scholars say that the dragon's way of naming things is the most precise description of one's soul and character. The name of a dragon generally depicts with certain precision how that dragon acts or looks like. Real-world names can also be translated as Dovazul names. For this, we need to know the etymological meaning of that name, in other words, what the name means in the language that it originated in. Let's take, for example, a very common name, for example, the name John. The name John comes from Hebrew, and it means grace and mercy of God. If we wanted to translate it to Dovazul, we had to take the key words from the name, in this case the words God, grace and mercy. In Dovazul, the equivalent words are Ra, Dun, Az. Putting them together we have Radenas, which is the Dovazulic version of John. Technically, you should be able to do this the other way around too. So for example, Alduin, whose name is comprised of 3 words, Al-Du-In, has Destroyer, Devour and Master as its literal translation, usually spoken as Master who destroys and devours. So if there's for example an Hebrew, Arabic, Spanish or German name which has Master who destroys and devours as its meaning, you can find out Alduin's real name in our languages. To be fair, I did some googling and could not find a real world name with that meaning behind it, but if anyone is able to find it, please let me know in the comments. I would find it hilarious if Alduin's real world name would turn out to be Gilbert or something. I mean, please let me know if you find anything out. Each dragon has their own name which basically characterizes themselves, and so do the dragon priests. However, the dragon priest names are usually 1 word as opposed to the dragon's 3. Think for example about the priest Ragot, which means anger, or Valok, which means guardian. Now, a little disclaimer, we have no idea whether these were their names or the names of their masks, which were bestowed upon them by the dragons. But this is basically the only thing that we know them by.
That said, that's about all I can say about the dragon language. Next up, and finally, we'll talk about Tamriel's primary language, Tamriellic, and how it's not just English, even though everyone just straight up speaks English in the games. Or actually, there's several different language packs, which I didn't actually know until a few years ago. It was really weird to see some Skyrim people talking German. But even in German, Tamriellic is not German. Tamriellic is its own language. And past me, for one last time, take it away. I already talked at length about the languages of the elves and stuff like alphabets on Tamriel. But those languages and alphabets are not the one that we see in the game most of the times. The language that is most widely used on Tamriel and is used most on Tamriel in general is Tamriellic. Tamriellic is a language not originating with one specific race, it's a mix of many other languages. Over the years it's essentially become Tamriel's native language, at least in the human regions at the moment. But let's back up a bit. Like I discussed in my lore lectures on the Dawn and Meretic era, all languages on Tamriel have the same origins in Old Elnufey, the language of the Elnufey, or the ancestors of the humans, elves, Khajiit, Akavir, and basically all other intelligent races on Tamriel except for the Argonians, who come from the Hist and not from the Elnufey. These Elnufey had their own language and alphabet, and a writing system based on an alphabet. Now, to quickly summarize the lore lectures, the Elnufey had some massive splits. They got isolated on their own continents and evolved eventually into the ancestors of the races that we see today. So the elves and the humans and the Yokudans.
This means that each Tamriellic language, other than the language of the Argonians, which again do not originate from the Elnove but from the Hist, has inherent similarities in structure, grammar and writing, because each race had its language basically derived from the old Elnove language in a very, very, very long past. Each race has an alphabet-based writing system as well because of this, and that's because they all evolved from the same starting point in terms of language and writing. This is a logical contrast to our own universe, where civilizations on our universe did not have a similar starting point, and thus civilizations on other continents got completely different writing systems as they developed it in isolation. For more on that, watch my lore lectures. What I wish to illustrate with this is that the peoples of Tamriel, except for the Argonians, will understand each other's languages relatively easily, because they have the same structures and origins in their languages baked in. After the ancestors of the elves and the ancestors of the humans landed on Tamriel again after their isolation, each had their own language which they developed on their own continents. The Aldmeri language on the continent of Aldmeris for the elves, and the Nedic language on Atmora for the humans. The Aldmer and the Needs, after coming to Tamriel, weren't always able to, exactly coexist in peace with the Heartland Elves, so the Aliots enslaving the human Needs in Cyrodiil, which would later become the Imperials, and the Elves of Skyrim, the Snow Elves, and the human Needs of Skyrim, later becoming the Nords, infamously fighting a bitter war until the Needs basically, killed off all the Snow Elves as they evolved into the Nords. However, it's clear that despite not liking one another at all, the humans and the elves were able to communicate with each other quite easily and understand one another. And that's because of this similar origin point of their languages. And in the place where the elves and humans did coexist relatively peacefully, namely in High Rock, there was even a sort of hybrid language between Aldmeri and Nedic, namely Old Bretonic, the language of the first Bretons, which are a mix between elves and humans, essentially, resulting out of interbreeding between elves and humans. Now, the thing is that Tamriellic, the language spoken by the majority on Tamriel in modern times, is most likely a mixture of both Elvish and human, because according to the Daggerfall Chronicles, we know that Tamriellic is actually an evolved product of the Cyrodiilic language, so not of the Bretonic language or the Nordic language, but of the Cyrodiilic language, which is the language of the early Imperials who evolved from the Needs in the Heartland, who were enslaved by the Heartland Elves, so the Aliots, before they were rebelling. Now, we know that the Needs enslaved in the Heartland took on many elements of the language of their masters, the Aliot Elves, into their own language, meaning that the early Imperial language is most likely a combination of both humanoid and Elvish languages. The language spread over Tamriel quite naturally after freeing themselves from the slavers, because the Imperials, after freeing themselves, established several Cyrodiilic empires over the ages. First the Alessian Empire, then the Riemann Empire, then the Septim Empire, and finally the Mede Empire out of the Septim Empire, which is the empire that we have in Skyrim. The Riemann and Septim Empires likely had the biggest influence on the spread of Cyrodiilic as the new Tamriellic White language. This is basically because they both established the majority of Tamriel under their control. Also, according to the Daggerfall Chronicles, we know that in the year 2813 of the First Era, the Riemann Empire actually instituted Cyrodiilic as the language to be used on legal documents within the Empire, meaning that it had become essentially the official language of the Empire's communication. And then the Empire occupied the vast majority of Tamriel and would do so for many more years under the Riemann Empire and the Akaviri potentates. During the time of the Akaviri Potentate, it's even possible that Cyrodiilic, and thus Tamriellic, was slightly influenced by the Akaviri language as well, making Cyrodiilic and thus Tamriellic possibly a product of both human, Elvish and Akaviri origin. It's fair to say that the only reason that this mixed language has become the most spoken language on Tamriel is that both the Riemann and Septim empires occupied the vast majority of Tamriel for several centuries each, thus forcing the local population of each of the provinces to interact with the empire in the Tamriellic language, forcing the people from each province to learn this language. This made it so that, for example, a Bosmer could effectively communicate with a Nord, because both had their own languages but also had to learn the Tamriellic language growing up, and thus both could communicate with each other quite easily, and they could quite easily learn the language as it contains both elements of human and Elvish languages, which are already a product of the same original language. So they both had the same starting point and now had the same end point, sort of.
Whether the factions outside of the Empire's control, for example the Altmeri Dominion in the 4th era, would try to banish the language from their lands to symbolize independence from the Empire is unknown. I mean, in the specific case of the Altmeri Dominion, they would actually probably do that since they wish to bring about a new Meretic era, so an era of Elvish dominance, where the superiority of Mer over man is essentially a standard for civilization, meaning that they would likely want the Elvish language to be the new Tamriellic language, and thus banishing the old Tamriellic language, which is a human language, according to them, because it was introduced by the human empires, even though it's a mix of both, but you know. So, the last two things before I end this video, I need to say two more things. First of all, the Tamriel itself has also changed over the years, as we find references to both middle and early Tamriellic in lore, meaning that the language currently spoken on Tamriel is likely late or modern Tamriellic. But this essentially means that Tamriellic itself has also changed since its inception in the early 1st era with Saint Alessia and stuff. And the second, Tamriellic is not English, German or French or whatever language you play the Elder Scrolls in. The language that we play in the games is simply an interface to make the games more playable. For example, in Morrowind, people were speaking both Tamriellic and Dunmerry during your playthrough, as for example Ashlanders or Telvanni wizards would not be speaking Tamriellic, because they are essentially independent from the Empire in many ways, and they hate outside cultures. It's simply an interface for gameplay, the language that we speak inside the game. We know that Tamriellic has its own words, grammar, sentences, etc., separate from English or French or German or whatever you play Elder Scrolls in, but we simply never hear or read it because of this interface problem, save for some very specific instances where we can find a word or two thrown around in a lore book. And that is basically it. All of my current and past work on languages on Tamriel. And I sincerely hope that you learned something new about the Elder Scrolls universe and that you enjoyed this long lore video. If you made it all the way to the end, I always do these with these collections, I would like to ask you a question. What's your favorite plant? I know it's a very unrelated question, but if you commented under this video, I will know that you have watched the entire video, and other people will be super confused, which would be really funny. Anyway, I want to thank everyone on the screen, which are my current Patreon supporters and all my YouTube members. And then I will end this video because it's been a long time and I feel kinda sick, not gonna lie. See you hopefully this weekend with a regular lore video, maybe next weekend. Bye bye.